The oil traced down her skin slowly, warm, viscous, carrying the scent of roses and something else she could not name. Messalina reclined upon a marble couch in the bathhouse, and the hands of her attendant kneaded her shoulders. Gently at first, then with greater force, penetrating deep into the muscles, releasing tension that had gathered for weeks. Steam billowed beneath the painted vaults, transforming everything around her into a ghostly haze. Droplets of water glided down the walls, leaving wet trails upon the white marble. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the touch. Fingers slipped along her back, descended to her lower spine, rose again to her neck. Every movement was measured. Not too firm, not too tender. Precisely so. Messalina sighed, feeling her body relax, feeling her thoughts dissolve into warmth and the fragrance of oils. Then they turned her onto her back. A fresh portion of oil, this time bearing the scent of sandalwood. It spread across her abdomen, and the attendant began massaging in circular motions. Her skin absorbed the liquid hungrily, became silken, gleamed in the light of oil lamps. The hands rose higher to her ribs, lingered there, then glided to her shoulders. The touch of fingers upon skin, the glide of oil across flesh, the weight of golden bracelets upon wrists. Thus did the empresses of Rome prepare for encounters that would decide the fate of empire. But Messalina knew. These very same rituals were performed in another place. In the brothels of the Subura, where courtesans anointed their bodies with cheaper oils, yet the technique remained identical. There, women possessed an art they had studied for years. They knew how to drive a man to madness with a single touch. How to make a man forget everything with the movement of a hand. And Messalina desired this power, all of it. What brought the Empress of Rome to squalid cells where they sold what she could obtain in the palace? The answer will transform everything you knew about this woman. Rome in the middle of the 1st century was a city where power and vice had intertwined so tightly that separating them became impossible. After the assassination of the mad Emperor Caligula in the year 41, after the birth of Christ, the Eternal City plunged into chaos. The Praetorian Guard, the true makers of emperors, discovered in the palace the 50-year-old Claudius, a member of the imperial family whom everyone considered unfit for power due to physical ailments and apparent simple-mindedness. But it was precisely him, trembling and stuttering, whom they elevated to the throne, because they needed a ruler who would appear manageable. Claudius proved to be a surprise. A historian who had spent most of his life in libraries, he approached governing the empire with a scholar's meticulousness. He reformed the courts, expanded the borders by annexing Britain, strengthened Rome's water supply system. But in his personal life, the emperor remained the same insecure man everyone had known. And beside him stood a young wife, Valeria Messalina, descended from the most ancient patrician lineage. Roman society of that era lived by double standards refined over centuries. Men, patricians, senators, equestrians, could visit brothels, public houses scattered throughout the city. They could keep mistresses, pursue liaisons with slave women and actresses. Society looked the other way. Moreover, it was believed that masculine nature required variety. But women, especially from the upper classes, were prescribed to embody virtue. A matron was expected to remain faithful to her husband, devote herself to home and children, serve as a model of modesty. Against the backdrop of these strict rules existed an entire world of women living beyond propriety. Courtesans of the highest order, educated, skilled in the arts, capable of sustaining conversation about philosophy and politics. Mimes, actresses whose performances often bordered on indecency. Inhabitants of brothels from expensive establishments on the Aventine to filthy dens in the Subura. All of them existed in a parallel reality where the men of Rome came seeking what they could not find at home. Messalina was born into a world where her every step was regulated by tradition. But when she became empress, the rules ceased to apply to her. Or she decided they ceased to apply. Ancient sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, paint her image in the darkest tones. They write of unbridled debauchery, of how the empress departed the palace by night and under a false name ventured to public houses, of a contest she allegedly arranged with a notorious courtesan, competing in the number of lovers, of a conspiracy with her lover Gaius Silius that nearly cost her life. But how truthful are these accounts? All sources concerning Messalina were written by men belonging to the senatorial aristocracy, that very class with which the empress entered into mortal struggle for influence over Claudius. Perhaps her image is a construct created by victors to justify her execution and blacken her memory. But perhaps within these stories lies a grain of truth, the tale of a woman who attempted to play by masculine rules and paid for it with her life. Morning in the imperial palace on the Palatine began before dawn. Messalina awakened to rustling, attendants entering the bedchamber on tiptoe, bearing lamps and a basin of warm water infused with herbs. First came ablutions. She lowered her face into the water, feeling sleep retreat, feeling her skin come alive from the touch of moisture. Droplets traced down her neck, rolled beneath the collar of her night tunic, and the empress gave herself over to the hands of her slaves. The process of dressing a Roman patrician woman was a ritual in which every detail held meaning. First came the tunica intima, an undergarment of the finest linen, so transparent that through it showed the contours of the body. Then the stola, a long gown that draped in folds and fastened at the shoulders with fibulae. For the empress, the stola was sewn from silk brought from the east along the Great Silk Road, fabric worth more than gold that shimmered in lamplight, shifting in hue from pale rose to purple. Purple was the privilege of the imperial family. The dye was extracted from sea mollusks. To dye a single toga required thousands of shells. The color emerged deep, saturated, transitioning from red to violet. Messalina loved this fabric, loved the sensation of silk against her skin, loved knowing that no one save herself and members of the imperial household possessed the right to wear such a color. After dressing began the beauty procedures. Roman women of that era were masters at crafting their appearance. Messalina seated herself before a bronze mirror, and the cosmetae, specially trained slaves, set to work. First they covered the skin with a thin layer of lead white to lend the face noble pallor. Aristocratic women avoided sunburn. It was a mark of low birth, evidence that a person was compelled to labor beneath the sun. Then with rouge made from crushed ochre, they accented the cheekbones. They lined the eyebrows with soot mixed with oil. They painted the lips with cinnabar, bright red pigment imported from Hispania. The hairstyle required hours of work. They anointed the hair with oils, combed it with ivory combs. The fashion of Claudius's time demanded complex constructions. Curls were arranged in rows, secured with pins, adorned with ribbons and diadems. Sometimes they employed wigs, fashioned from the hair of Germanic or Gallic slave women. Fair locks were especially prized. Every strand had to lie perfectly. One improperly arranged braid could cost a slave punishment. Jewels completed the image. Messalina possessed treasures capable of eclipsing the treasury of a small province. Necklaces of pearls harvested from the shores of Britain. Earrings set with emeralds from Egypt. Bracelets heavy with gold that chimed with every movement of her hand. Rings upon all fingers, some set with precious stones, others signets with which she sealed her commands. But the empress knew in Rome there existed women for whom the art of adornment was not merely a tribute to fashion, but the sole weapon of survival. Courtesans of the highest rank spent hours preparing for an encounter with a client. They studied the subtleties of massage, employing oils with fragrances capable of driving men to madness. They possessed techniques of which respectable matrons were not supposed to know. They were trained in music, dance, the art of conversation. They could quote Virgil, sustain discussion of Senate politics, perform upon the lyre, a composition that would make a listener forget everything. Messalina attended banquets where these women entertained guests. She observed how they moved, every gesture calculated, every glance bearing a message. How they laughed, not loudly but melodiously, compelling men to draw near the source of that sound. How they touched, as if accidentally, in passing, yet leaving a trace upon the skin that would not be forgotten. The empress watched and understood. These women wielded power that she, despite all her titles, did not possess. Night descended upon Rome, bringing with it coolness and silence. The palace on the Palatine sank into slumber. Only scattered torches burned in the corridors, casting long shadows upon painted walls. Messalina stood at the window of her chambers, gazing at the city that spread below. The lights of lamps flickered in the darkness, transforming Rome into a scattering of stars fallen to earth. Behind her, an attendant combed her hair, slowly, methodically, drawing the comb from roots to ends. The empress closed her eyes, surrendering to the monotony of movement. In her mind, thoughts swarmed, always, without cease. She thought of Claudius, who now, most likely, sat in the library over some documents. Of senators, whose looks full of contempt she caught upon herself ever more frequently. Of how rumors about her had ceased to be merely rumors. She remembered how it all began. The first years of marriage were torture. Claudius treated her with the detached courtesy of a man who never expected attention from young women. He spent nights among books while she remained alone in vast chambers, listening to the footsteps of guards in corridors. It was then she first understood. To be empress did not mean to possess power. Power belonged to freedmen who managed the emperor's chancellery, to senators who whispered counsel to Claudius, to praetorians who could make or destroy a ruler with one motion. Messalina resolved to fight. She began attending banquets where Rome's elite gathered. She learned the art of conversation, the ability to interest or repel with a single word. She observed courtesans invited to entertain guests and adopted their methods. Not crude, but subtle. How to hold a pause in conversation. How to look so that a glance seemed accidental, yet remained memorable. How to touch, lightly, fleetingly, leaving desire for more. Then appeared Gaius Silius, handsome, from an ancient family, ambitious. He looked upon her not as senators did, with condemnation or fear, but with frank admiration. Between them arose a connection, at first merely an intrigue, then something more. Silius began speaking of power, of how Claudius was weak, how the empire needed a strong ruler, of how together they could transform Rome. Messalina was not naive. She understood she was using him just as he was using her. But in this game existed an excitement that drowned out the voice of reason. She felt alive, for the first time in years, spent in the golden cage of the imperial palace. And she continued playing, raising the stakes, not noticing how around her the noose tightened. One day, when Claudius was away, Silius proposed conducting a ceremony, a symbolic marriage. It was madness, a challenge to all laws of Rome. But Messalina agreed. They arranged a banquet at Silius's house, invited guests. Wine flowed like a river. Musicians played, and amid the revelry, Silius placed upon her finger a ring, as if she truly had become his wife. Word reached Claudius that very day. His freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, those who truly governed the empire, understood. This was not simply marital infidelity. This was conspiracy, an attempt at a coup. They convinced the emperor to act immediately. Praetorians stormed the banquet at dawn. Guests scattered. Silius was arrested and led away. He did not even manage to resist. Messalina was warned by those who still preserved loyalty to her. She attempted to flee, to reach Claudius, to plead for mercy. But it was too late. The empress stood in the palace gardens. Those very gardens where once she had walked as a young girl, newly made wife of a failure from the imperial family. The sun inclined towards sunset, staining the sky in shades of red and gold. She heard the approach of footsteps, measured, confident. Praetorians. Messalina knew what they had brought with them, knew that entreaties were useless. She sank to her knees before the statue of a goddess standing by the fountain. Water murmured, reflecting the last rays of sun. The empress whispered a prayer, brief, one her mother had taught her in childhood. Then she straightened, raised her head. If she must perish, then with dignity. The sword pierced her swiftly. She felt almost no pain, only coldness that spread through her body, and surprise at how quickly it all ended. The last thing she beheld was water in the fountain, pure, transparent, reflecting the sky turned crimson. Then darkness. Messalina departed this life at 28 years. Claudius commanded her name erased from all official documents and monuments, a practice Romans called damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. Statues of the empress were destroyed, inscriptions obliterated. Her children, Octavia and Britannicus, grew up scarcely hearing their mother's name. Rome pretended that Valeria Messalina had never existed, but memory proved stronger than commands. Historians wrote of her, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius. Their texts overflow with accusations of debauchery, greed, cruelty. They paint the image of a woman monster, embodiment of all vices that can belong to a person. But reading between the lines, one may perceive something else. A young woman given in marriage to a man twice her age, an empress without power, surrounded by enemies, a person who attempted to play by masculine rules in a world where women were not permitted this. The courtesans of ancient Rome, about whom those same historians wrote with contempt, often ended life better than Messalina. The most skilled among them accumulated fortunes, purchased houses, liberated themselves from slavery. Some became influential figures. Their salons were frequented by poets and politicians, their opinions valued. They lived in shadow, but this shadow granted certain freedom. They were not touched by the strict demands placed upon matrons. They could choose lovers, dispose of their earnings, build lives according to their own discretion. Messalina was born in a golden cage and perished attempting to break free. History judges her harshly, but history is written by victors. And victorious were Claudius's freedmen, senators whom she attempted to remove from influence over the emperor, the patrician elite, shocked by the behavior of one who should have been a model of virtue. Was she monster or victim? A woman of loose morals whose name justly became synonymous with vice, or a woman slandered by enemies? Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Messalina was a human being with weaknesses and desires who found herself in a situation where any false step meant death. She played a dangerous game and lost. But her story is not about that. Her story is about how in the ancient world, women deprived of formal power sought ways to influence events. How beauty, charm, the art of seduction became weapons in the struggle for survival. How the boundary between empress and courtesan sometimes blurred, because both employed the same thing, their feminine nature, to achieve their ends. The difference lay only in that some were exalted for it, while others were cursed. Rome endured 4 more centuries after Messalina's passing. Dozens of emperors succeeded one another. Dynasties rose and fell. The empire expanded and contracted. But the name of the young woman executed in the gardens of the imperial palace was not forgotten. It lives in texts, in legends, in historians' disputes. And each time this name is spoken, a question arises. Who was she truly? There exists no answer. There remain only shadows of the past, fragments of testimony, and the eternal mystery of the human soul that cannot be unraveled even after 2,000 years. Here it is, the true account. Messalina was not the monster of legend. She was a woman who attempted to play by masculine rules in a world where this meant tragic departure. She was slandered by enemies because she dared to be strong. And we still believe what the victors wrote. Can you imagine how many such stories lie hidden behind myths? If the truth about women of the past intrigues you, leave a like. It inspires me to dig deeper. Subscribe so you will not miss the next revelations. And press the bell. I'm preparing material that will overturn your understanding of Eastern harems. Soon you will learn how one concubine transformed the fate of an entire empire, using only intellect and patience. Thank you for being with me. Until we meet again soon.